Well, hi everyone. Thanks, Larry. That was quite the introduction. Yes, I am actually very excited to be here and do this talk because I learned so much from SVC, and I'm really, really grateful to be able to pass on some of what I learned. Hopefully, you'll see some threads of the SVC philosophy in my talk. I have to give Larry credit for this amazing title of this presentation. It was something different at the IA conference. But I love it, and that's Larry's work. So, friend or foe of job seekers. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This idea for this talk kind of began almost a year ago, and a lot has changed both in the AI world and also for me professionally in my own journey. So this has been a bit of an evolving process. So I recently gave this presentation at the IA conference this year, and what I'm going to share with you today is adapted from what I shared there. And I also incorporated a bunch of new material from the conference that I learned, and that conference was really talking about the AI landscape and what information architecture is and how we're kind of positioned as information architects to use AI and to think about it differently in our work. I will say that my audience at the conference was mixed. So there were some job seekers, a lot of job seekers, but there were also people working on the design side of the HR systems. So I really had to speak to both sides. And when I was thinking about this presentation for SVC, I kind of toyed with leaving a little bit of that content in here that was geared toward those HR professionals, because I do think it's important for us to think about job searching as kind of relationship building. And a lot of what we talk about in UX design is having empathy for users and the business sides of the business functions. So you're going to hear some of my personal philosophy come out, and part of building a relationship is that empathy building and understanding. So, okay, I want to start this conversation by talking about this idea that job applications are really this nuanced information exchange. There are tons of ways to land a job, but usually there's always this information exchange that happens in that early stages of the job matching process. And a job application is just one tool that we use for facilitating that information exchange. But job applications are really full of these nuances that we can only interpret as humans. And if we think about those nuances, we can start to understand if and when and how we can even start thinking about AI as another tool that we can use in that process. And I want to explore what happens to that information exchange when we start to lose track of that nuance and deprioritize our human relationships in favor of things like efficiencies. So I crammed a lot of really big, juicy topics into what I think is going to be a 30-minute presentation. And each of these items could easily warrant its own talk. So I'm going to just start by telling you that I might actually leave you with more questions than I'm able to answer, because this is a bit of a weird time that we're living in. Also, anyone who claims to tell you that they can immediately solve all of your job searching problems is probably trying to sell you something maybe that you don't need. And I think it's really important to zoom out and understand this big landscape that we're living in so that we can orient ourselves and we can find a way, just find our way in the job searching process. And my goal today is to help you just feel a little bit less alone if you're one of those people looking for a job, and to give you a couple of tools to work with as you're doing all of this really hard work in preparing your job applications. And Larry, I'll send the slide deck so everybody can have the slides as well. I want to talk about what this talk is not, and it is not how to land your dream job by asking a language model to write your application materials wholly for you. There's a lot of work that goes into finding the right job, and most of it has to do with understanding yourself and also understanding what your potential future employer needs. So AI might be a good tool that we can use to communicate ideas, but it does really lack a lot of important context about those nuances. You have a really unique skill set and a lot of strengths, and AI can't really fully understand those and doesn't have all of the context it needs. AI also doesn't have any insider knowledge about the job that you're applying for. So it's not this magic potion that you can drink. I wish it actually was, because that would make things a whole lot easier. This is a bit of a complex human problem. And in my talk at the conference, I talked about the flip side of this, and you can rest assured that I'm not really advocating for AI on the other side of this either. I did a lot of research, and I learned that there are some really well-designed applicant tracking systems, and there is some pretty good AI momentum, but a lot of times these systems are just not properly implemented at the organizational level. Organizations are constantly reevaluating their hiring workflows to deal with these challenges. And whether or not you're concerned with that as a job seeker, it does kind of shed some light on the organizational function or dysfunction that you might be getting yourself into. I do have a couple of differentiation strategies to help your application become seen, but what I learned in my research is that there is a bit of a direct conflict between being fully differentiated and complying with these applicant tracking system requirements. So the more differentiated your application materials are, the less likely they are to surface up through the applicant tracking system and be seen by an actual human. And this is just a pretty unfortunate symptom of the congested job market right now. So I'm going to talk about this topic. I look at this through 3 different lenses. And the first is that this is a UX and information architecture design problem. As Larry mentioned, I do have a background in UX design. I worked as a UX researcher and information architect, and in fact, I had some pretty large enterprise clients. And I spent the last 6 years in Seattle at that consulting firm. I'm also looking at this, the biggest lens here is as a business problem. And so we have to talk about markets and stakeholders and return on investment and economics and all of those big fun business challenges. And if you're a job seeker, these are really, if you're entering an organization, these actually could be some of your realities that you're looking to face. And then the third lens I want to look at this through, Larry kind of mentioned this, but it kind of became a little personal for me. So I pitched the idea for this talk a year ago, and one of the many hats at the time that I wore was in recruiting and hiring. And I got to write and publish job description, and I felt how overwhelming that process was with just the number of applicants we received and the pressure to move candidates forward and make, the right choice. And I saw a lot of what I can only assume was AI generated content. And I can imagine that the feelings that I felt would just be amplified at larger and more complex organizations. So, but with all of the tech industry turmoil, this topic became kind of personal in that time. And now I am also looking for my next career opportunity. So I've been doing a lot of soul searching to try to find the right match for myself and position myself as qualified and differentiate myself from other candidates. And I think I'm also still trying to decide how I feel about AI and about prompt engineering and about all of the different outputs I'm receiving when I use things like ChatGPT. So if you are looking for a job, which is, I suspect, why you're here, I just wanted to say that I'm actually in this with you. So I want to start really talking about markets because the job market is a market. And I want to take a little bit of an economic approach and share some market principles that we can use to create this shared understanding. The first is that markets are a place to transact. And most often when we think about markets, we think about money in exchange for goods and services. And in the job market, money is definitely a part of that, but it's kind of secondary to this transaction of human abilities and performance outputs. So there's human work that needs to be done, and then there's a human who is capable and interested in doing that work. And there's a common currency that we kind of use in this transactions as humans, and that is trust. And when trust is mutually exchanged, these transactions like job matching can happen really smoothly. And I'm going to use the word human very intentionally in this talk today because it helps us see how when we start to add AI to that, it complicates that trust in that building of that relationship. So when we start to use AI for efficiency instead of as relationship building, we can kind of see how it gets a little messy. The second market principle I want to talk about is that markets have rules for transacting, and these are the constraints that we're operating in. So sometimes those rules are really defined and formalized. They are things like legal rules or terms and conditions or contracts, that kind of thing. And in the job market, those are typically enforced by a human resources department, and we're all very familiar with human resources. But there are also these rules that are kind of underdefined or even undefined. And those are things like social rules and cultural norms. And that can complicate our transaction process. And one of the job market rules that we often don't think of is that we apply with a job application. And that's that information exchange that I was talking about. So employers need to actually collect information from you somehow to get an understanding of who you are and compare you to the other candidates. So when we start playing within these new rules by like adding AI into our process on both sides, our understanding of those rules gets a little more complicated. And as much as I hate to say it, AI tools are not going away. So we do have to figure out how to change and adapt to these new rules of exchanging information. And then the third market principle I want to talk about is that markets are connected. So like people, markets have, they're connected to each other. So we can't talk about the job market without also talking about the labor market. But there are other economic conditions and forces to help us understand how complex of a system we're dealing with here. There's also the housing market and the childcare market and the education market. And those all make up this economic system that we live in. And those adjacent markets also affect your decision-making as a job seeker. So the housing market might affect your commute. That's just one example. This is really oversimplified, but if we think about the interconnectedness of how this all works, we can understand this big problem space that we're operating in. So I thought about this, and another form of currency that I think helps with connection is this idea of caring. And that is, we can use that in our interactions actually as leverage to help us kind of navigate this system. And only once we care about things and like relationships and problem solving, can we start to add AI in to that process. So I just put a slide in here for recap, but about markets, I really do think these things go a little bit beyond economics, and they kind of go into our sense of empathy. But the market is a place for humans to transact. You can use trust and caring as currencies, as leverage in your transactions. We have to operate within a set of rules, and this job market doesn't really exist in a vacuum. But matchmaking is actually a really complex human problem. So you want the right job, but employers also want the right applicant. In 2012, Alvin Roth, he won the Nobel Prize for his work on what he calls matching theory. And he spells out the way that this matching idea is different than commodity markets, and it works differently. So in a commodity market, there's typically a price or some other one-way signal that facilitates a transaction. So somebody is selling an apple, they signal a price, someone else buys an apple, and that's kind of the end of that transaction. But in a matching market, decision-making happens on both sides, and there's often negotiations as part of that transaction. So in the case of job market, content creators are also content consumers. So if you stop and think about this, you are consuming content as a job applicant. You're consuming things like job descriptions, employer websites, kind of all of this nebulous content that all has signals for you to react to. And then you create some content in the form of an application that you submit to your potential employer, and they get to react to that. And both parties will continue to send these signals back and forth until a match is made. And if you're applying for a job, you're actually engaging in this matching process, and it's very complicated, but it can be really vulnerable, but it can also be really empowering to know that you're playing a part of that. And those signals are a big part of this matching idea. So in the case of landing a job, signals are sent in both directions. So if the receiver on either side struggles to interpret those signals, you can think maybe the sender hasn't made those signals clear. So sending the right signals is important, but you can't really send signals without understanding yourself and your own motivations first. So I'm sure you've all done, self-reflection exercises, and you'll know that that's actually a lot harder than it seems. But companies are not off the hook. They also have a big responsibility to treat the candidates that apply like human beings, and they need to send the right signals to run a fair and unbiased process and to create job descriptions that accurately reflect what it is that they're looking for. So I like to think of this as there's some vulnerability and there's some risks on both sides. And it's important for both parties to understand the other's perspective. But I I want to just explore what happens when the job market becomes really congested and gets competitive, because that's kind of where we're at right now. So in this stack of books, somewhere is probably your favorite story that you haven't read yet, something that is so wonderful. And imagine having to read the same stories over and over and never discovering the one book that would make an impact. This is what HR departments are up against. AI and automation has really contributed to this flooding, and it has created a ton of noise for recruiters and hiring managers. So employers need to filter applications through what they're calling applicant tracking systems. And this is a way to manage these really large volumes of information and deal with this congested market. So it gets really weird for the humans on both sides who have to make these decisions, right? Because there's a human on the other end who has to kind of navigate all of that information. I want to take a break. This is the only AI generated image that I use in this entire slide deck. I promise. My daughter didn't have enough Lego minifigures for me to take a good photo, but I really liked the concept. So there's this term called choice architecture, and it refers to this practice of designing and presenting choices to decision makers in order to affect the decision makers' behavior and ultimately their outcome. HR departments are using applicant tracking system to help narrow those choices down so that a real human can make a decision. And in my presentation at the IE conference, I actually did talk about the corporate responsibilities and the ethics of all of this, because there is some real value in using this kind of choice architecture to deal with the overwhelm. And I think that AI might be sophisticated enough for this eventually, but I argued that it really can't help companies if they aren't really aligned on what it is that they're looking for, which is often the case. So if you're a job seeker, you probably already interacted with some applicant tracking systems, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what they are. I already spoke to why they're necessary, but they are also deeply flawed, and we'll talk about that here in a second too. So applicant tracking systems are designed to help organizations, efficiently gather and sort information. So there's typically some sort of scanning and sorting process to evaluate candidates based on some sort of set of criteria that the organization decides, ahead of time. They're a way to keyword match your resume against the job description. There's usually some sort of sorting and ranking mechanism. And then also applicant tracking systems are part of the whole process for facilitating hiring, progress, and follow-up if you're lucky. But I want to go back to signals, because I think this is kind of a key piece. If you're going to get your application or through the applicant tracking system, you need to first understand and interpret the signals that you're seeing, and hopefully they're not as scrambled as this television. And then we can finally talk about how AI can help. But with signals, some signals are really implicit, some are hidden, and some reflect some really deep biases and often actually exaggerate the biases that we're seeing. So I want you to imagine for a second being barefoot. And imagine that each job posting that you come across is a pair of shoes that are looking for human feet. So those jobs all have requirements. And this metaphor is by no means perfect, but if you consider that each job description is sending you signals about the nature of work that needs to be done, then you can assess the best way to apply. So there are a lot of clues in that job description that can help you decipher what it is that you're looking at. So maybe you're looking for something with a lot of support. Maybe you want something that indicates status, or maybe you just want to try it on to see if it's a good fit. Or maybe it looks really good, but it also looks like it could be really uncomfortable. These are all the signals that you get to react to. And I think it's important to know that the signals may not always be clear, and you may have to do a lot of guessing about what's in that job description. Or maybe the signals are crystal clear in the case of these goth Crocs. Okay, so you've reviewed the job description and you've interpreted the signals, however flawed they are. And now it's time for you to craft your application. Well, it turns out there's an important step between interpreting the job description and being able to send your own signals, and that starts with answering 2 questions in a self-reflection exercise. How capable are you and how interested are you? You have to do a lot of work in applying for a job, but I would argue that most of that work is on understanding yourself. And answering these questions is going to help you understand whether or not you should even apply for a job. It's also going to help you craft a really authentic application and one that expresses your personality, articulates your goals, and demonstrates your qualifications. So one tool to do that is to plot your interests and your qualifications on a matrix. Business majors love 2x2s. So on one axis is how interested are you in doing the job? Can you even envision doing this work? Does it even sound remotely enjoyable? And on the other axis is how qualified you feel. And remember, this is based on those signals that you receive from those job descriptions. So are the shoes even in your size? And the goal is to be as honest and as open-minded with yourself as possible. So if you look at the signals from your job postings and you find yourself kind of here in this lower left quadrant, there are probably better ways that you can spend your time and energy. If your qualifications and interests land near the middle of this matrix, you might need to do some more thinking and more learning and researching. Maybe there's one particular reason that you're not interested, and is there room to negotiate, and you could find out if that interest could be swayed. Or maybe this is your dream job, but you're not qualified yet, and you could let the signals in that job posting help you figure out some next steps to get there. The sweet spot is obviously being very interested and highly qualified. And once you know that, you can start to figure out how to communicate those qualifications and express your interest. I do want to point out that because the listed qualifications are often so nuanced and your abilities and experience are also very nuanced, those qualifications don't necessarily need to be a one-to-one match. So if your imposter syndrome starts to creep in, you can find new ways to become confident in yourself or to view your unique skill set differently. Okay. So you found your dream job posting and you know you're qualified. All that's left is running this race to sell and differentiate yourself. And all you have to do is get it out of your head and write it all down, and you get stuck. So that's where AI comes in, right? So you head to your favorite language model and you write a prompt. Write me a 2-paragraph statement of interest for a marketing job. So as a passionate marketer with a keen eye for innovation and a dedication to driving results, I am thrilled to express blah, blah, blah. Large language models will output exactly what you ask them for, and they make a lot of assumptions. I didn't feed this anything about my experiences, my skills, or my interest. I also didn't feed it anything about the job that I'm looking for. Now, you're not going to do that, right? You know that your content needs to be tailored to your experience and to the recipient's needs. You are not going to submit this kind of content to a potential employer, right? But in my research, I spoke with an HR manager who receives content exactly like this. And because the applicant tracking systems are keyword driven, content like this actually makes it through those systems. So on one hand, you want to get your content through the applicant tracking system to actually talk with somebody and land an interview. On the other hand, if you spend too much time and energy on keyword metrics for the applicant tracking system, your resume could lack personality or authenticity. So what do? When you seek convenience, you have to accept some trade-offs, and using AI is no exception to that. Hiring managers are human beings, and there's a lot of evidence that customization and authenticity really resonates. AI-generated content can often come across as robotic or insincere. And as you saw in my example, AI-generated cover letters typically lack this personal touch. So even if you do get through the applicant tracking system with generic content, once a hiring manager sees that, your chances of landing an interview are going to be pretty diminished. AI also can't possibly understand the nuances of a job seeker's experience or qualifications, and often can output inaccuracies or errors. And at worst, that could harm your credibility. Lastly, AI tools may have limitations in their creativity and strategic thinking. When I was reviewing applications at Factor, one of the telltale signs of AI-generated content was just how vague the language sounded. So applicants who rely solely on AI-generated content are going to miss opportunities to showcase their full range of skills. So there's also a bunch of biases that can be introduced into the hiring process that start with the application tracking system and then are reinforced by the material that comes through. And here are some common biases and how they are exacerbated. So AI encourages applicants to mimic word-for-word phrases from job descriptions. So this overlooks candidates with equivalent qualifications, but just has slightly different wording. There are resumes with non-standard formats could lead to certain candidates being completely overlooked. And format bias encourages applicants to conform to templates rather than express unique qualifications in creative formats. Applicant tracking systems also prioritize candidates with a certain number of years of experience or from certain industries, which can overlook candidates with transferable skills or non-traditional backgrounds. And that really reduces diversity in the candidate pool. Many applicant tracking systems also unintentionally exacerbate unconscious bias and do things like only surfacing candidates with male-sounding names. I wish I was making this up. And since we're talking about both perspectives, job seekers, you're not the only ones that are frustrated with these biases. So oftentimes, especially at large, complex organizations, the humans in HR who are doing the screening and the sorting, they don't have all of the context for the individual role that they're hiring for. So especially if those roles are specialized, they rely on this job description with keywords and they do their darn best to expedite the process. A Harvard Business School report called How Businesses Can Find Hidden Workers found that 88% of hiring managers were not satisfied with these applicant tracking system outputs. And even the Society for Human Resource Management has to publish content to address problems with poorly designed and poorly implemented systems. I am not even going to go into the metadata mishaps that can weed out highly qualified applicants. This is a real system glitch. For a job application, I uploaded my resume and these fields were auto-populated with my city and state. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but you can imagine the frustration that you're probably feeling when you get system errors like this. You'd probably redesign your resume and try to figure out how to optimize it. But I do think, I spoke to this a lot at the conference, there's this shared responsibility here in handling that nuanced information exchange because good information architecture has real world implications. So here are some ways that AI might help. If you're a job seeker, you can write prompts to decode signals and understand what the job applications are asking. AI can help with idea generation and editing, and you can even ask it to version your resume. But many of these AI tools run on the same kinds of language models. And again, they don't have a lot of insights about the actual job or the people or your specific skill sets. And oftentimes what I came across is that the good features, those are often paywalled. So you end up spending money for features in these AI tools that, may or may not get you any sort of better results. But I do want to talk through 3 strategies for navigating this kind of big broken system and get your materials noticed. So the first one is there a way to bypass the applicant tracking system altogether? So networking is a tried and true job search method, and the chances that you'll find an in are way higher. Larry actually has a whole presentation about this that he has pointed me to. Find an email address or a LinkedIn contact and send your materials directly to a real person. Find someone on the inside of the company who can surface your resume. And when you connect with a real human, ask what kinds of things does the hiring manager want to see on my resume? These are those human-to-human connections that can help you become seen. Okay, this strategy is extremely risky and I had to throw it in here, but maybe you're just going to martyr yourself in the process. But especially if you're looking for a creative role, there may be ways to get noticed by being a rebel. So you don't necessarily have to conform with a broken system. So maybe there are some hacks or workarounds by entering content into these applicant tracking systems that acknowledges the challenges you're facing with the process. Just be prepared to fully justify those decisions when you land an interview. You can use your design or information architecture skills for good, and you can make an honest critique of the hiring process itself. This could show your character and it could help you get noticed, especially if you can find a way to propose a really good design solution. All right, this is my least favorite, and I do have some tips, but it takes some really diligent work, and you can never really fully know if you'll be successful because of that nuanced information exchange that I've been talking about. I will say that playing the keyword game is by no means any easier than any of the other strategies, but if you want to try it, I do have some tips. Feed the AI as much context as you know about the job. So make sure you feed it the exact job description and any other concrete information you have. Then give it as much context as you can about your own skill set, your experience, and your education. Be prepared to be frustrated with the outputs. You can ask for a list of the top 5 words or phrases that you might need to incorporate into your application materials and how many times those phrases should appear. You can Google how to do this. There are tons of research. There are tons of resources out there on writing the right prompts. But just remember to spend 3 times as much energy in editing your materials, and don't trust the results whole cloth. And if something an AI generates doesn't feel right, it probably isn't authentic. And trust me, it's pretty apparent on the other end. So I have some do's for using AI. I talked about this a little bit, but feed it pretty specific context. You can use AI to help you interpret the signals from the job description. So maybe you ask that, maybe your prompt is something like, what kinds of skills is this looking for, or simplify the language in this job posting. Do customize and humanize the outputs that you're receiving. So maybe you ask the AI to help you write in a very specific tone or language. I've seen some successful outputs with that. I think edit as many times as you can, just because it sounds like language that a human might speak doesn't mean it sounds like your voice. And also, I think staying ethical and not trying to get an AI to, mislead a hiring manager is pretty important. I also have some don'ts, which are: don't over rely on the AI tools. Don't ignore data and privacy concerns. So I'm not really qualified to talk about that, but I do know that there are some issues with feeding your personal information to AI. And I think that it should definitely be something you at least consider. And I spoke about this a little bit, but don't use AI tools to deceive hiring managers. It's just not a good idea. We don't want to feel like we're being selected by a computer. And we, as job seekers, inherently want to know that there's a human on the other side who understands us and will value us for our skills and our contribution. I think this is just a really unfortunate game we're playing right now. And I would argue that there isn't actually a shortage of qualified workers, that there is just a shortage of applicants who can actually make it through these systems. And trust me, I spent a lot of time in my IA conference presentation arguing for just better system design. The more research I did on this topic, the more I actually wanted to name this talk Robot Seeking Robot: How Applicant Tracking Systems and AI-Generated Job Applications Are Dehumanizing the Hiring Process on Both Sides. I do know job searching is hard, and I really wish that AI could